So after what seemed like years of rumors and speculation about an upcoming Switch Pro, Nintendo finally put all the guesswork to rest by casually announcing an upgraded Nintendo Switch model via Twitter on a quiet Tuesday morning. But was it the more powerful 4K capable Switch we'd been hearing about from industry insiders and outlets like Bloomberg for months? Well, no. No, it wasn't. There were certainly elements of this upgraded model that were correct and leaked out ahead of time: the larger OLED screen, the wider kickstand, and the added Ethernet port. But the big glaring omission was the total lack of any type of performance improvement or 4K capability. And while I was certainly disappointed to see no mention of an improved processor in the Switch OLED trailer, as a longtime Nintendo fan, I can't say I was all that surprised. So today I wanted to share a few thoughts about my overall impressions of the Switch OLED model, what this could mean for the elusive Switch Pro, and what I hope to see from Nintendo and the Switch line in the future. And real quick, if you're new here, make sure to subscribe so you can stay up to date on everything happening with the channel. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. So right off the bat, I want to say that I'm well aware that there's a large group of people who are pretty sick of hearing about the Switch Pro. And I can totally understand that. If you're someone who doesn't really follow the hardware side of things and you're happy with the way games look and play on your Switch, then I can understand the rumors about the Switch Pro seeming almost relentless and borderline obnoxious this past year. So this isn't going to be some hopium-filled video about the possibility of a Switch Pro still coming out early next year or anything like that. I just hope that whenever Nintendo does release more powerful hardware, it's some kind of continuation of the Switch line with a very similar form factor. So let's start with what we are getting with the Switch OLED model. And I have to say, I think Switch Pro does make for a better name, but without any performance boost and all the expectations surrounding a more powerful Switch, I can understand why Nintendo chose to steer away from anything like that. We are getting a larger 7-inch Samsung OLED screen, something that was specifically mentioned by Bloomberg back in March of 2021. In case you're unfamiliar with OLED screens, OLED stands for Organic Light Emitting Diode, but really all you need to know is that OLED screens produce deeper colors and truer blacks, so dark areas of the image will actually appear as black rather than gray, and you can expect a higher contrast image with a more vibrant and saturated look. The original model of the PlayStation Vita actually has an OLED screen, and it's definitely the one I prefer over the later model's LCD screen. So for anyone that spends a good amount of time in handheld mode, this is certainly the biggest upgrade to look forward to. We also got a wider, more stable, and highly adjustable kickstand that runs along the entire width of the Switch tablet, something that is definitely a welcomed improvement since the flimsy, off-center kickstand of the base model Switch left a lot to be desired. Internal memory has been doubled in capacity from 32GB to 64, and while more storage is nothing to complain about, if you're someone who primarily buys digital games, you're most likely still going to need an extra microSD card for expanded storage. The tablet speakers are also seeing a vague improvement in quality. Early hands-on impressions of the Switch OLED mention the speakers sounding a bit louder and fuller in tone, but nothing that amounts to a groundbreaking improvement or anything like that. There's also a very slight redesign to the tablet body, with fan vents that look more similar to the Switch Lite, as well as slightly different power and volume buttons. Everything about the Switch OLED Joy-Con, however, appeared to be exactly the same as the current versions. Moving over to the dock, it's seeing a slight redesign, one that I think is quite attractive, especially the white version. The hard angled corners of the dock have been rounded off, the Switch logo made a bit smaller, and the back flap is now removable. There's also an added Ethernet port, something that will surely be appreciated by competitive online players, but it does replace the previous USB 3.0 port of the base Switch model. So all in all, it's a nice little bump in quality over the current Switch. I'm certainly looking forward to playing Metroid Dread in handheld on that nicer screen, but it is a little disappointing that the docked experience will be completely unchanged aside from the added Ethernet port. At the very least, I guess, I'm happy to see Metroid Dread getting a little marketing boost by launching alongside the slightly updated console. Now on to what we didn't get, and before I start, I just want to be clear that I love my Switch. It's probably my favorite console of all time at this point. For the most part, I'm perfectly happy with how games look, and I fully understand the performance compromises needed for portability. And while Nintendo clearly isn't having any problem selling Switch units at the moment, I do find myself wishing we saw more improvements under the hood than what we're getting with the Switch OLED, which, yeah, are none. So let's start with the obvious. No improved processor. The Switch OLED is using the exact same Morrico Tegra X1 SoC as current model Switches, so performance will be identical. Certainly the most disappointing aspect of the announcement, especially after all the 4K and DLSS rumors. The Switch was already fairly underpowered when it hit shelves in March of 2017. Luckily, Nintendo are masters of developmental wizardry on their platforms and still managed to produce some of the best looking games this generation. But when the Switch OLED launches this October, nearly 5 years after launch, the Switch will really be starting to show its age. Even Nintendo's own titles are starting to make more obvious compromises. Bowser's Fury, one of my favorite games of this year, doesn't even achieve 1080p in docked mode, featuring a variable docked resolution that hovers a little above 720p. Luckily it hits a solid 720p in handheld mode, but the frame rate is then cut in half to 30 frames per second. Recent titles like Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity and Monster Hunter Stories 2 also feature some very obvious frame drops and chugs, something we didn't see quite as much of in the early days of the Switch. And while I understand battery life and cost are certainly at play when it comes to the Switch's portable nature, rumors of Nvidia's power-efficient AI-driven DLSS upscaling certainly sounded enticing. I had been spending a good amount of time on my PS5 around the launch of Monster Hunter Rise, and when Rise came out, I played the first few hours in handheld mode where I was honestly pretty impressed with the visuals. But when I played the game on our 65-inch 4K set, I legitimately thought my eyesight was getting worse. That's when I realized Monster Hunter Rise hovers around 750p in docked mode, so forget 4K, we're not even getting 1080p for a lot of games at this point. Another missing feature from the upcoming Switch revision is Bluetooth support. And let's be real, this is nearly inexcusable in 2021, especially with the Switch OLED's $350 price tag. I use wireless earbuds with nearly every device I own, and my wired iPhone earbuds use a lightning connection, so that forces me to either carry around a separate pair of 3.5mm headphones specifically for the Switch, or use a $40 third-party Bluetooth adapter. And lastly, no improvement to the Joy-Con. Now, this is something I'm probably the least disappointed about. I know there are plenty of people out there who have had multiple pairs of Joy-Cons succumb to the dreaded drift, but it's something that I really haven't had any issue with. Either way, it still would have been nice if we saw improved analog stick components, or something that could make customers feel a little more confident in the lifespan of the Switch's detachable controllers. So what does all of this mean for the long-rumored Switch Pro? Well, no one really knows. I think there are multiple scenarios that could have played out internally at Nintendo that got us to this point. It's entirely possible that at one point, the Switch OLED was intended to have improved specs, but for whatever reason, maybe due to the current chip shortage situation, Nintendo decided to scrap that idea and Bloomberg's information was simply out of date. I also think it's possible that there were two Switch models being developed, the upcoming Switch OLED, and then maybe a slightly beefed up 4K capable version that could see a release late next year or sometime in early 2023, and outlets and insiders simply conflated the two. Or maybe this really is just it for the foreseeable future. The Switch is still selling like crazy and could very well become Nintendo's best-selling console of all time. I think the idea of a more powerful Switch made so much sense when considering potential third-party ports of PS5 or Xbox Series X games, but with how slowly we're seeing both Microsoft and Sony move completely away from supporting last gen, maybe Nintendo doesn't need to release more powerful hardware just yet. So maybe instead of a mid-cycle upgrade, we instead see a Switch 2 or Super Switch several years from now. And that brings us to what I hope to see from Nintendo and the Switch line in the future. As I mentioned earlier, I simply hope that Nintendo sticks with the Switch name and overall form factor whenever they do end up releasing more powerful hardware. That might be a little out of character for Nintendo, who loves to create innovative new ways to play with each new console generation, but I just think the Switch is too perfect a concept to simply abandon for some other hardware idea, at least for the next few generations. This is especially true seeing as how Nintendo merged their handheld and home console development divisions ahead of the launch of the Switch. As a busy adult, the Switch fits so perfectly into my lifestyle, and it's the console I spend the most time on. Sure, I'm an unapologetic Nintendo fanboy, but convenience also plays a huge factor. I still want to be able to play my games on the go, and have the option to play them on the TV. I'm just ready for them to run a little smoother and look a bit better. I do hope that Nintendo does eventually improve the Joy-Con as well, with whatever the next iteration of the Switch ends up being, but I'd also love it if they offered optional Pro-Cons that could be purchased separately. I understand the Joy-Con form factor makes sense when needing them to function as standalone controllers for co-op play in tabletop mode, but that is without a doubt the playstyle I use the least, and the Joy-Con really are fairly uncomfortable to use in handheld mode for long periods of time. I know there are third-party grip options out there, but I'd love something official from Nintendo that's more ergonomic, includes NFC support and HD rumble, and maybe a D-pad as well. So there you have it. Overall, I'm a bit let down that the Switch OLED wasn't quite the upgrade we're all hoping for, but if we do ever end up seeing more powerful Switch hardware at any point in the future, I'll be one happy camper. Let me know down in the comments what you think of the Switch OLED. Are you planning on picking one up this October, or are you waiting for Nintendo to release something more powerful? If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like on your way out and also consider subscribing. And until the next video, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.